Good Wednesday to you. I told you the other day one of the biggest challenges is for me doing these videos is my wardrobe. So if you're looking and saying, "Hey, he hadn't changed shirts since yesterday," that's not true. I'm just making two of these at one time, trying to get a little bit ahead, so that if something would come up and hinder, I'll still be on schedule and not have to skip a day and start getting text asking me where the video is, like I do when I'm running behind. So I'm just trying to cover myself a little better. All right, let's dig in. Psalm number 5 this morning. Psalm number 5. We're going to look at this psalm. Going to spend a little bit of time here on the background on this one and the makeup of it, and then we'll get into a few of the verses. When we look at this psalm, you'll notice the superscription says it is to the chief musician upon Nahiloth, a psalm of David. And so what we have there in that superscription is we have who it's to, how it's to be played, and who it's from. It's to the chief musician, obviously. Upon Nahiloth means it is to be played on flutes, and that David wrote the psalm. I will tell you just in passing, there are some who throw out the idea that this is not really a psalm of David, but their argument's kind of thin, and I'm not even going to waste your or my time going down that road. I think there's enough evidence that says that it is a psalm of David. In all 150 psalms, if you say this is a psalm of David, you will be right more times than you are wrong. And so I'm going to stick with it being a psalm of David. David is writing here a psalm that is a response. I believe it's still connected to the third and fourth psalm that we just finished, and it is a response to the slander that is going on. The people who have been trashing David. Even we saw in the fourth psalm where some of his own people were saying, who's going to help us? And so obviously, if his own people are talking junk, then there's a really good chance that Absalom and his followers are talking about David. Again, the history of the psalm we don't have here. It doesn't really, the superscription really doesn't, tell us anything about who or the situation in which David wrote. But I think when you read the psalm, I think it's pretty clear that it fits in with what David has wrote in the previous Psalms in 3 and 4. Again, there are some who would disagree that it's even a Psalm of David, but it's basically based on the definition, the Hebrew definition of one or two words, really one word, how the word temple is used in the verse. But again, I think that's a pretty thin argument, so I'm going to stick with David. This psalm is another, Psalm 3. It is a psalm of lament. David crying out. It is a psalm of anguish. It is also the first of a type of psalm that is important for us to know about. But do cause some people some trouble in reading them. This is one of, and there's others that we'll come across. This is part of a group of psalms known as an imprecatory psalm. And by imprecatory, what it means is this is one of those psalms where we have David crying out for God to send down fire, break their jaw, knock out their teeth. The imprecatory psalms are the psalms where the psalmist calls for God to destroy the enemy. And again, it's interesting because the difference we have in Psalm 4, he was basically pleading with his enemies, praying that they would repent, praying that they would change their ways. Here, he's going to pray against his enemies. A little different tone. Hard to tell what had transpired, what events had happened between his writing of chapter 4 and the 5th Psalm. But something's changed David's opinion of his enemies. And so instead of praying for them to change their ways, he prays for God to change them, I guess is a good way of saying what they are doing. So David is going, I think, just to tell you up front, our takeaway, I believe, from this psalm is then what do we do? How do we handle those who would slander us? How do we handle what do we do with those who talk about us? And everybody that's going to watch this video and everybody that doesn't watch this video has been attacked verbally at some point along the way. So let's dig in and see how David handles those who would attack him. Verse 1, he says, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation." First thing David does is David, he doesn't load up his slingshot or call out the army. David turns to God. He doesn't try to defend himself. Most of us have, we've experienced it, we just may have not learned it, that ordinarily the more we try to defend ourselves, the worse we make it. Also, one of the things for David to remember is that the people who are attacking him are his former citizens. They are, they're Jews like him. They're family. And so rather than try to handle things on his own, try to take things into his own hands, David begins by begging God to, Lord, hear me. And so David is, he's calling for God to listen to his prayer. That's his first way in handling this situation. And so what do we learn from David? Obviously, already touched on it. We ask God to hear our words. There were all kinds of things being said about David at this time. They were, saying that he never was of God, that he never was God's man. And Absalom had been very crafty. If you go back into 2 Samuel and read, David had been Absalom, had been very good at putting together his attack. He had done it basically through words. He had slowly turned the people against his father. He was good looking. He had the long pretty hair, the silver tongue, just kind of the typical silver-tongued devil. And he had used his words and spread all types of rumors and things about David. And I think what happened was David realized at this point that it was too far gone. That he couldn't do anything himself about Absalom's lies, about the things that had been said, and so he realizes his only hope is to turn and to trust God. They had, and so he says, Lord, consider my meditation. It was, again, his kind of a constant talk is what that word is talking about. And so David, the same word is used to describe how the Israelites were talking, how those who were following Absalom murmured is one of the other words. Whispered is probably the best way for us to understand it. How they were whispering about David, and so rather than going back and starting a whisper campaign, David whispers to God. And so he says, Lord, consider. It means to, for David to, David is calling on God to, the word that he uses there to consider, it's kind of weird, means to separate. And so what David is saying is, Lord, separate the lies that are being told in Jerusalem from what I'm saying about you, or saying to you. And so first thing he does then is, Lord, hear me. And then he says, hearken unto the voice of my cry, my King and my God, for unto thee will I pray. David, his next action here is then that he, again, as he cries out to God, it's obvious he's desperate just by reading his words. His former citizens and servants were now supporting Absalom. And so David pleads with God to listen to him instead of the voice of the people. And he does something here that I think is wise for us to learn. And it's common sense. Basically, David, after saying, "Lord, listen to me," then he says, "For unto thee will I pray." David basically says, "Lord, I'm going to be your servant. I'm going to do it your way." I don't want to say he's buttering up God, but he's pledging allegiance to God. He's wanting God to listen, and so he says, Lord, I'm going to submit myself to you. I'm going to acknowledge you. Notice he says, my King and my God. He puts himself in that role of servanthood to God. I want God to listen to me. I'm going to put myself in a right relationship with him. David doesn't, David recognizes that, and so he begins by crying out to God, and in that, again, he puts himself in the right place of submission to God. And he says, unto thee will I pray. He said, you're my King, you're my God. I submit myself to you. I'm going to be obedient to you. I'm going to follow your lead. David, in just a minute, if you look down in verse, to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, he says, you destroy them that speak leasing. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man. And so David says, I recognize, Lord, you take care. You destroy those who lie, those who deceive, and so he is submitting himself to the authority and the power of God. He's not calling on man to help him, but he is crying out for God to help him. And he goes on then in verse 3 and says, my voice shalt thou hear in the morning. In the morning I will direct my prayer unto thee, and I will look up. David is saying, I'm going to begin my day with prayer. He says, I'm going to, I'm going to start each day by directing my prayer to you. I'm going to start my day off. I love, there's no saying that says, don't talk to man about anything until you've talked to God about everything. Well, that's kind of the message that David is giving us here, that I'm going to start my day out. He told us, it's interesting, he told us in the previous psalm, I'm going to lay down and go to sleep. And then here he says, but I'm going to start my day talking to God. I'm going to trust God, and I'm going to go lay down and go to sleep. But when I get up in the morning, I'm going back to God. And I'm going to put my day, and in David's case, literally his future, in his hands. We learn from David, something very, I think, important here is sometimes the best thing we can do with enemies is ignore them. Not always. There's times when we have to defend, we have to step up. But Proverbs teaches us that a wise man knows when and to respond to what Proverbs calls a fool. Many times when we fight back, we make things worse, and so we end up, if we're not careful, we'll drop down to slander, to lies about the other person. And so many, if probably not most times, it's better for us to follow David's example of simply giving God our issues, our burdens. I think probably most of us have lived long enough to experience. It's kind of like you see with the media. Somebody will give a 20-minute speech, and it ends up being a 10-second soundbite on the news, and they take the 10 seconds of words and and do what they want to with them. It's kind of like I learned years ago. You can make the Bible say what you want to. You go to one spot and it says Judas went out and hung himself. You go to another place and it says, go ye therefore and do likewise. And you go to a third place and it says, what you do, do quickly. And that's what happens to our words many times when we try to defend ourselves. And then the other thing that happens to us is if the person who is slandering, the person who is attacking you is not a Christian or not really known for their spirituality, and you are, and you stoop and you respond, there people, the outside people looking in, they're not surprised that man who's not a believer, not very spiritual, is running his mouth, is talking bad about you, is putting you down. But as a Christian, when you respond, people are like, can't believe you did that. And so it's very easy to damage our testimony. As tempting and as sometimes gratifying as it is to respond, sitting here, and listen, I'm preaching to the choir, sitting here by myself, recording a video, it's easy for me to say, and I know it's true, that the most of the time, it's kind of like that thing we learned as children. Sticks and stones may break my bones, and what is it? I'm rubber, you're glue. What you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Some of those childhood things. Sitting here and right now, it's easy for me to say that, but I know it's a lot harder to do. But David shows us that it can be done, that we simply, we take our battles and we give them to the Lord. We've got to be wise to how Satan works. Satan sometimes, he baits us and draws us into those no-win situations. I'm going to preach a little bit here. It's happened to me. It's happened to plenty of people. Be careful what you type on social media. Again, people who, they see all your other praise God, bless God, I love my church post, and they ignore those. But you type one angry word in response to somebody, and that gets chiseled in stone. And so David gives us a great example here, that a very practical example for us in dealing with those types of situations. That the best thing that we can do is simply bite our tongue and give it to God. Now, we know David was a warrior, and there were times when David stepped up and again loaded his slingshot and popped a giant between the eyes. I'm not saying Christians should be doormats. I'm saying we should choose our battles very carefully. To use Judge Pressler's words, is it really a hill worth dying on? And most of the time, we discover after the fact that it wasn't worth dying on. That we would have been far better off just to let that enemy, let them talk. The people who know you and know the truth, they won't, they'll ignore it, and the rest of them really don't matter. Just being very practical this morning as we look at the opening of this psalm. I hope that helps you today. I hope that helps you this week. Be very careful in how we respond to the enemy, how we respond to slanderers. Many times it's a trap, it's a bait. And so David teaches us here, Lord, I'm not going to fight this battle on my own. I'm going to take it to you. All right, have a great day.